Andrea's roommate was startled by the sudden, violent sound of a crash. Heart pounding, she hurried to the balcony, only to freeze in horror. From Andrea's room, thick gray smoke was curling outward, quickly giving way to flames that leapt hungrily toward the ceiling. Panicked, she grabbed a spare key and, with the help of others, forced Andrea's door open. A wave of dense smoke rushed out. Inside, the fire had already taken hold, its heat oppressive, its spread merciless. Through the shifting haze, they could barely make out the dim silhouette of a figure lying motionless on the bed. They called Andrea's name again and again, their voices breaking with fear, but no reply came. The fire roared louder, swallowing furniture, walls, and hope. With the flames advancing and the smoke becoming unbearable, the young women were forced to retreat, helpless and terrified for their friend's fate. By the time firefighters arrived, chaos had already consumed the building. Residents stood huddled outside. Yet among the evacuees, Andrea was missing. The reality settled like a heavy weight. She had not escaped. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Andrea Del Vesco entered the world on June 29, 1994, in the city of Chicago, Illinois. She grew up surrounded by a tight-knit family that included her loving parents, an older brother who often acted as a protector, and a younger sister who would become her closest companion. The Del Vescos were well established. Her father managed a successful investment firm, which provided the family with comfort and opportunity. Despite their financial security, Andrea's parents emphasized kindness, education, and faith. After the birth of her youngest sister, the family decided to relocate to Austin, Texas, where they believed the children could grow up in a thriving community with strong schools. Andrea was soon enrolled in a respected Christian academy known for its rigorous academics and disciplined environment. From the start, Andrea excelled. She threw herself into both academics and athletics, quickly making a name for herself as a determined and multi-talented student. She played on the field hockey and lacrosse teams, earning recognition not only for her athletic skill but also for her dedication and teamwork. Beyond sports, Andrea discovered a gift for languages. She studied Spanish and Latin, and teachers often commented on her sharp memory, pronunciation, and genuine passion for communication across cultures. By the time she graduated high school, Andrea had a collection of awards and honors that highlighted her commitment to learning and growth. When it came time for college, Andrea applied to several of the nation's top universities. After much thought, she chose the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where she planned to pursue a double major in psychology and Spanish. Her love of Spanish was so strong that she often spoke of one day living in a Spanish-speaking country to immerse herself completely in the culture. Her parents had initially hoped she would attend a university closer to Chicago, where her older brother was already studying. They believed having him nearby could provide a sense of comfort and oversight. Still, they ultimately supported Andrea's decision to chart her own path in California, recognizing her independent spirit. Once at UCLA, Andrea flourished. In her very first week, she joined a sorority, immediately connecting with other young women who would become lifelong friends. She thrived in the close-knit environment, attending campus events, bonding with her sisters, and balancing the demands of rigorous coursework. Though her family was financially stable enough to support her fully, Andrea often worked part-time jobs. She wanted to contribute, to feel the pride of earning her own way, and to prove that she could handle responsibility. Her classmates and sorority sisters remembered her as warm, approachable, and dependable, the type of friend who would stay up late to listen, help decorate for events, or volunteer when no one else wanted to. By 20 to 15, Andrea was entering her senior year at UCLA. At just 21, she was preparing for the exciting, uncertain transition from college student to graduate. That year brought a new milestone. Sorority and fraternity members entering their final years were allowed to rent small apartment-style complexes just off campus. These spaces offered a greater sense of independence while still keeping students close to the heart of university life. Andrea and her closest friends eagerly embraced the opportunity and moved into one of the coveted residences. Around this same time, Andrea's nurturing personality revealed itself in another way. She adopted a small chihuahua from a local animal shelter, instantly forming a bond with the rescue dog. Caring for the little companion soon inspired her to volunteer at the shelter regularly, adding yet another layer of service and compassion to her busy schedule. September of that year was particularly important to Andrea and her sorority sisters. It was recruitment season, the time when they welcomed new freshmen into the house. Preparations were intense. Posters needed to be painted, decorations created, and displays arranged to impress potential new members. On the evening of September 20th, Andrea and her friends worked late into the night, laughing, planning, and perfecting every detail. As the night stretched into early morning, one by one, the girls retired to their rooms. Andrea stayed up a little later, sitting in the living room with a friend, chatting about life, school, and the exciting days ahead. By 3:30 a.m., she finally began to drift off on the couch before later making her way to her bedroom. A few hours later, Andrea's upstairs roommate was startled awake by the sound of an unusual noise and the sharp barking of the small dog Andrea had adopted. The sound seemed to come from Andrea's room. Concerned, the roommate tried calling her phone, but there was no response. Worry creeping in, she quickly decided to call the police. Within minutes, officers arrived at the residence. When they entered, the building appeared calm. The noise had subsided, the barking had quieted, and there were no obvious signs of forced entry or disturbance. The officers carefully looked around, noting that most of the residents were still asleep. With nothing clearly amiss, they reassured the roommate that it might have been nothing more than a dream or a misunderstanding. Choosing not to wake the others, they left. Yet almost immediately afterward, chaos erupted. Andrea's roommate was jolted again, this time by the sound of a loud crash. She rushed to her balcony and froze in shock as she saw smoke curling out of Andrea's room, quickly followed by flames climbing upward. Even more disturbing, she witnessed a man, unfamiliar and hurried, emerging from Andrea's room, wrapped awkwardly in a blanket. In the next instant, the building's fire alarms blared to life, and panic swept through the residence. Students scrambled to evacuate as thick smoke filled the hallways. Some of Andrea's sorority sisters ran toward her room, desperate to help. They were shocked to find the door locked, something unusual in a house where doors were almost never secured. Using a spare key, they forced the door open, only to be met with dense smoke and rapidly spreading flames. Through the haze, they could barely make out the silhouette of a figure lying motionless on the bed. They called Andrea's name again and again, but no reply came. As the fire consumed the room, the young women had no choice but to retreat for their own safety. By the time firefighters arrived, the scene was one of confusion and fear. Students huddled together outside, many crying, others desperately trying to understand what had just happened. Andrea was nowhere to be found among the evacuees, and the reality of her absence quickly became clear. It took a team of 32 firefighters more than 15 minutes to get the flames under control. When first responders finally managed to gain entry into Andrea's room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Inside, through the haze of smoke and the acrid scent of burned fabric, they discovered the body of a young woman. Within moments, law enforcement officials moved in and secured the space, understanding the gravity of what they were facing. The evidence were carefully transferred to the medical examiner's office for a full evaluation. But even before confirmation came, detectives and students alike already knew who it had to be. Several of the young women in the sorority identified the room as Andrea's. She was the only resident unaccounted for during the chaotic evacuation. Her absence from the crowd of frightened students gathered outside left little room for doubt. The weight of that realization sank heavily over the group. The sense of tragedy deepened when firefighters reported that Andrea's beloved Chihuahua had miraculously survived. The small dog was quickly transported to a veterinary clinic for treatment, offering at least a sliver of relief in an otherwise devastating scene. Although official confirmation required time, News of the event swept across the UCLA campus at lightning speed. By the following morning, thousands of students had heard whispers about the fire, the missing sorority member, and the assumption that Andrea's life had been lost in what people initially believed to be an accident. Many speculated about faulty wiring, an unattended candle, or some other everyday mishap that had spiraled out of control. The narrative of a tragic but accidental fire seemed plausible, at least at first. But the firefighters who had battled the blaze noticed anomalies right away. Their training told them that fires leave behind stories in their burn patterns, and this story didn't fit the outline of a simple accident. The electrical outlets remained intact. No appliances were scorched or shorted. The usual culprits, like overloaded power strips or forgotten candles, were absent. Instead, their eyes were drawn to something deeply out of place. On the bed, sitting almost unnaturally close to the body, was a trash can. That detail alone raised suspicions. Upon closer inspection, fire investigators determined that the fire's point of origin was inside that very trash can. The implication was chilling. Someone had deliberately placed it on the bed and set it alight. The idea that Andrea had done this herself was unthinkable. Fire officials quickly relayed their observations to law enforcement. Soon, forensic specialists began combing through the room inch by inch, collecting samples, photographing evidence, and documenting every detail. Their discoveries made the case even darker. Stains containing DNA were found across the bed and floor, large, undeniable, and impossible to reconcile with the theory of an accidental fire. The evidence suggested that something far more sinister had taken place. Meanwhile, medical examiners worked with meticulous care to confirm the identity of the victim. The fire had been so intense that even fingerprints had been destroyed, forcing investigators to rely on dental records. When the results came back, the devastating truth was officially confirmed. It was Andrea Del Vesco. The autopsy uncovered even more disturbing revelations. Injuries on her body suggested the involvement of foul play rather than a tragic accident. The most critical detail, however, came from an examination of her lungs. No smoke particles were present. This meant Andrea had not been alive when the flames engulfed her room. She had died beforehand, and the fire had been set afterward, likely in an attempt to conceal the crime. With that finding, the case shifted abruptly from an accident to an active homicide investigation. Detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department began their inquiry by interviewing the sorority members who lived in the complex. They needed to know everything: who had been awake, who had been out, and who might have noticed anything unusual that night. The questions came carefully but firmly. Did Andrea have enemies? Was she seeing anyone? Did she appear worried about anything in the days leading up to the fire? The consensus was strikingly similar. Andrea was not in a relationship. She didn't seem to have ongoing conflicts, and no one could think of a person who might wish her harm. But then, one resident, who had already been the one to alert police in the early hours before the fire, provided an unsettling account of her own. She explained that earlier that morning, after dropping her boyfriend at the airport, she returned home around 5:30 a.m. Entering the courtyard of the sorority complex, she climbed the stairs toward her room. As she placed her key in the lock, she sensed movement behind her. Turning, she saw a man standing at the bottom of the staircase. The moment their eyes met, he bolted. Startled, she quickly entered her room and secured the door. Her mind raced. Should she call the police? After a few moments of hesitation, she convinced herself that perhaps the man had simply been a fellow student, maybe someone visiting another resident. She hadn't seen his face clearly, but she did remember distinct details about his appearance. He wore a black baseball cap, a dark t-shirt, and jeans. Though rattled, she called her boyfriend to describe the encounter. He reassured her, and eventually, she tried to sleep. Less than an hour later, however, she awoke to the very disturbances that prompted her call to police. Officers had come and gone, finding nothing unusual. But soon after their departure, more noises echoed from downstairs. Curious and increasingly fearful, she stepped onto her balcony. That's when she saw something that froze her in place. a man climbing out of Andrea's window wrapped in a red blanket. She instantly recognized him as the same figure she had seen earlier at the stairs. Panicked, she shouted toward him, but he fled. Desperate, she rushed outside to try to follow where he went, but the intruder had already vanished into the night. What caught her eye instead was a car leaving the area. A red Nissan. She couldn't catch the license plate, but something about the rear windshield stood out. Bold letters, unmistakable, displayed the abbreviation of a fraternity, Lambda Chi Alpha. This detail electrified detectives. A possible link to a fraternity car provided a direction, a potential lead in a case that until then had seemed clouded by uncertainty. Still, investigators knew they had to tread carefully. The neighborhood surrounding UCLA was crowded with students, many of whom drove similar cars. The presence of fraternity letters could be coincidental, the vehicle nothing more than another college student leaving a late-night gathering. Even though the initial lead seemed thin, investigators pressed forward. They began by following up on the clue involving the red Nissan with the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity letters in the back window. One by one, detectives interviewed every member of the fraternity. They asked detailed questions about cars, travel, and whereabouts during the night of the fire. Yet, the young men all denied owning or even knowing anyone who drove a red Nissan. None admitted any connection to the suspicious vehicle. It was a dead end, at least for the moment. But detectives didn't stop there. Expanding their circle, they crossed the street to a neighboring student complex to see if anyone else had noticed unusual activity that night. What they learned immediately shifted the course of the investigation. Residents told police that their own apartment had been burglarized during those very same early morning hours. Several valuable items had been stolen, including a laptop, a Bluetooth speaker, and assorted electronics. The timing was striking, and investigators wondered whether these incidents were linked. What caught their attention most was the Bluetooth speaker. Detectives knew that in order to operate a brand new wireless speaker, the user had to register it through the manufacturer's online system. That meant the moment someone tried to activate the stolen speaker, a digital footprint would be created. Realizing this could be a breakthrough, detectives contacted the company directly. They handed over the serial number and asked to be alerted as soon as the device was registered. It became a waiting game, one hinging on the moment the thief finally tried to use the speaker. While detectives worked quietly behind the scenes, the tragedy surrounding Andrea began to spread across the UCLA campus and beyond. At first, police did not publicly disclose that her death was being investigated as a homicide. Officially, it was still presented as an unexplained fire, and many assumed it was an accident. Word filtered through the student body, sparking speculation but no clarity. For Andrea's family, who had flown from Texas to Los Angeles in shock, the reality was even harder. They learned the devastating truth not from officials but from Andrea's sorority sisters, young women who were just as shaken, yet trying to provide answers where authorities had not. Her mother, overcome with grief, demanded to see Andrea with her own eyes. She simply could not accept that her daughter was gone without that confirmation. Meanwhile, the family was hit with another painful blow. Andrea's Chihuahua, the loyal pet rescued from the flames, had been rushed to a veterinary clinic. Despite the best efforts of medical staff, the little dog did not survive its injuries. Andrea's parents later said that as heartbreaking as it was, they took comfort in believing the pup was now reunited with Andrea in heaven. Back at the LAPD, progress remained slow. Detectives pursued the red Nissan lead but came up empty at every turn. No registration matches, no witnesses willing to identify a driver. Days dragged on, and with each one, pressure mounted. Then, finally, the long-awaited call arrived. The stolen Bluetooth speaker had just been activated. Investigators now had an IP address, which traced back to a residence in Fresno, California, about 3 hours north of Los Angeles. A team of detectives immediately traveled to Fresno, where they knocked on the door of the listed residence. Inside, they met a man named Joseph. When questioned, Joseph admitted that he had registered the Bluetooth speaker online, but he claimed the speaker wasn't his. Instead, he said it belonged to his roommate, a 22-year-old Fresno State student named Alberto. According to Joseph, just days earlier, Alberto had left for Los Angeles to attend a concert. He returned on September 22nd, one day after Andrea's death. And he hadn't come back empty-handed. Joseph recalled Alberto arriving home with the Bluetooth speaker in hand, along with a collection of odd items: dishes, towels, bottles of alcohol, and other miscellaneous belongings. When Joseph asked about the haul, Alberto brushed it off, saying a friend in Los Angeles had recently moved and gifted him the things he didn't want to pack. To Joseph, the explanation seemed strange but not worth pressing further. To detectives, however, it was a glaring red flag. Digging deeper, they discovered Alberto had no prior criminal record. On paper, he was an ordinary college student, but his vague explanations and suspicious timing painted a different picture. It took several days of careful surveillance to confirm his location. Finally, on September 26th, law enforcement officers surrounded the Fresno home where Alberto was staying and arrested him without incident. At the station, Alberto initially offered a rehearsed, calm story. He said he had traveled to Los Angeles to see a friend who lived near UCLA. Together, they attended a concert and spent the following days drifting between parties before he headed home. When pressed about the Bluetooth speaker, Alberto suddenly feigned ignorance, claiming he had no idea what the detectives were referring to. But when investigators presented him with undeniable evidence that the speaker had been stolen and recovered at his own residence, his confidence cracked. His story shifted. Now, Alberto claimed that the speaker wasn't his at all. It belonged to a friend from Los Angeles, the same one who supposedly gave him a ride back to Fresno. The narrative was clearly unraveling. Detectives turned once more to Joseph, who had been cooperative from the start. Joseph's recollection dealt another blow to Alberto's version of events. He was certain he had seen Alberto return home alone. Not only that, but he personally witnessed Alberto carrying the Bluetooth speaker, along with the other stolen goods, into their garage. There was no mystery friend, no rideshare companion. Confronted with this contradiction, Alberto's story collapsed yet again. This time, he admitted outright that he had stolen the items himself. He explained that on the night in question, he and a friend had attended a student party near UCLA. According to Alberto, some of the people there had treated him rudely. Fueled by alcohol and anger, he claimed he decided to teach them a lesson by taking whatever he could. He described swiping the laptop, the speaker, and a handful of other random possessions, saying he had been so intoxicated that he barely realized what he was doing. Alberto, realizing the detectives weren't satisfied with his shifting explanations, decided to offer yet another version of events. This time, he added a dramatic new claim. According to him, around 5:30 that morning, after leaving a party near UCLA, he and a friend were confronted in an alleyway by a stranger lurking behind a dumpster. Alberto said the man stepped out of the shadows, pointed a firearm at them, and demanded they hand over their belongings. Rather than comply, Alberto claimed he and his friend ran, and as they sprinted away, the stranger allegedly fired a shot in their direction. On the surface, it was a sensational story, one that might have explained some of the chaos from that night. But detectives immediately had doubts. No neighbors reported hearing gunshots, and no shell casings or bullet damage were found anywhere near the area. The more Alberto talked, the more his account seemed like a desperate attempt to redirect suspicion. Detectives pressed him further, shifting the questioning back to Andrea's neighborhood. They asked directly, had he gone into any women's dorms or sorority houses while in Los Angeles? Alberto hesitated, but then claimed he had met two students through a mutual acquaintance. He insisted that was the extent of his interactions, that nothing more had happened. But the investigators weren't convinced. With experience on their side, they leaned in harder, telling him bluntly that his story didn't add up. Under mounting pressure, Alberto began to unravel again. He pivoted to yet another narrative. Now he claimed that during the same party where he had stolen the Bluetooth speaker, his friend, someone he identified as Eric, met a young woman who lived across the street from the gathering. According to Alberto, this woman invited Eric to come with her. He said he didn't know her name at the time, but when detectives asked for a description, the details lined up with Andrea. As the questioning continued, Alberto slipped. He described her clothing in detail, then accidentally mentioned her name. Detectives exchanged glances. This wasn't the slip of someone guessing randomly. This was someone with first-hand knowledge. It was becoming clear that Alberto was weaving stories as he went, but in doing so, he was also exposing details only the perpetrator could know. When the detectives pressed him to go further, Alberto faltered. He put his head in his hands, sat in silence for several seconds, and finally muttered, almost under his breath, "All right, it was Eric." This new story placed the blame squarely on his companion. Alberto claimed that only minutes after Eric left with Andrea, he came running back, visibly shaken and clearly disturbed. Alberto said Eric told him they needed to leave immediately, confessing that he had done something serious. According to Alberto, Eric admitted to attacking Andrea and, as they rushed away, discarded a pair of rubber gloves he had been wearing at the time. Alberto went on to say that later. After seeing news reports about Andrea's death, he confronted Eric through messages. In these exchanges, Alberto claimed, Eric confessed outright to being responsible for her death. The detectives, seasoned in spotting deception, listened carefully but remained skeptical. They knew Alberto's story had shifted too many times already. Still, procedure required that they pursue any lead, no matter how unlikely. They asked for Eric's address, and Alberto directed them to an apartment complex just minutes from Andrea's sorority house. When police knocked on Eric's door, he answered calmly. They questioned him about the night in question. Eric admitted that he and Alberto had attended a student party nearby, but insisted nothing unusual had occurred. He claimed that after leaving the gathering, they returned to his apartment around 3 a.m., went to sleep, and didn't stir again until late morning. He admitted he had been drinking heavily, making his memory hazy, but stuck firmly to his version of events. Detectives weren't satisfied, and while they continued to question him, they noticed something important about the apartment complex. The building was covered in surveillance cameras, positioned at multiple entrances and exits. They immediately requested the footage from the night of Andrea's death, knowing it could make or break both men's accounts. When the video arrived, it told a very different story. The first clip showed Alberto and Eric returning to the building at 2:40 a.m., earlier than Eric had claimed. And detectives noticed something striking right away. One of them was dressed in a black baseball cap, a dark t-shirt and jeans. That detail was critical because it matched exactly the description Andrea's upstairs neighbor had given of the man she saw lurking near the staircase hours earlier. And in the footage, the man wearing that outfit wasn't Eric. It was Alberto. The camera revealed more. At 4:30 a.m., the footage captured both men leaving the building once again. This time, they lingered outside for a while, drinking and talking before disappearing off camera. They weren't seen again until 7:11 a.m., when they finally returned home. And there, clear as day, the video showed Alberto wrapped in a distinctive red blanket. The very same one Andrea's sorority sister reported seeing on the man fleeing Andrea's room as the fire erupted. The video contradicted both men's statements and directly linked Alberto to the scene. For detectives, the evidence was damning, yet questions still remained about Eric's role. Was he a passive bystander? A participant? Or was Alberto simply trying to drag him down to spread the blame? Investigators brought Eric back in for another round of questioning. This time, they showed him the surveillance footage. They demanded answers, pushing him to admit what really happened. But Eric didn't budge. He stuck to his original story, maintaining that nothing out of the ordinary occurred that night. Even with Eric's denial, the case had crossed a critical threshold. Detectives now had enough to make arrests and secure search warrants. Both Alberto and Eric were taken into custody. At booking, officers noticed something telling. Alberto's hands were covered in fresh scratches. The scratches covering Alberto's hands immediately drew suspicion. To the seasoned eyes of investigators, they looked exactly like defensive wounds. When detectives questioned him about it, Alberto responded with a dismissive shrug. He claimed he had been in a fight at a party but couldn't remember with whom, nor could he explain why the wounds matched the timeline of Andrea's final struggle. Meanwhile, forensic specialists were busy examining every possible location tied to Alberto and Eric. Their first stop was Eric's apartment. Investigators conducted a meticulous search, scouring surfaces, floors, and furniture for any trace evidence. What they discovered raised immediate red flags, several suspicious stains. These samples were carefully collected, sealed, and rushed to the lab for DNA analysis. Detectives then turned their focus to the mysterious red Nissan that had been spotted near Andrea's building. Tracking it down confirmed their suspicions. It belonged to Alberto. Even more telling, the back window carried stickers with the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity letters. The search continued at Alberto's own home, and it was here that detectives found the most damning evidence yet. Inside a trash bag tucked away among his belongings, they uncovered the very same red blanket seen by Andrea's sorority sister the night of the fire. Alongside it were several other incriminating items, a knife and clothing that matched descriptions from witnesses. Every piece was immediately secured and sent to the lab for detailed testing. Detectives now felt that the case against Alberto was becoming irrefutable. But the story did not end with physical evidence. Soon, one of Alberto's neighbors came forward with information that chilled investigators. According to this witness, when Alberto returned from Los Angeles, he casually mentioned that a student had been murdered right across the street from where he had attended a party. What struck the neighbor most wasn't simply that Alberto knew about the crime. It was how confidently and carelessly he spoke about it. As the lab results trickled in, any lingering doubt evaporated. Forensic analysis confirmed that DNA samples taken from Alberto's vehicle, from the knife, and from his clothing all matched Andrea. The evidence was undeniable. With that confirmation, prosecutors felt ready to move forward with formal charges. Both Alberto and Eric were indicted for murder. Still, detectives weren't entirely convinced that Eric had actively participated in the crime. As the case moved closer to trial, prosecutors reassessed. In time, they altered Eric's charges, reducing them from murder to aiding and abetting, along with burglary related to the neighboring apartment break-in. He pled guilty to the reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison. Alberto's trial formally began in 2018, drawing widespread attention from students, faculty, and community members who had followed the case for years. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the case reached its final chapter. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for September 21st, 2018, exactly 3 years to the day after Andrea's death. The symbolism of that date was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. When the judge delivered the sentence, he made the reasoning crystal clear. Alberto Hinojosa Medina would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole.